The Hack Music Theory YouTube channel published a video which attempted to address the topic of polymeter being the simultaneous occurrence of two or more meters. In this video, they drew a distinction between polymeter and polyrhythm, but I wasn't convinced that their example demonstrated the difference quite as clearly as is possible, so I wanted to add to the discussion by clarifying exactly what a polymeter is and how it differs from a polyrhythm, according to my own understanding and research. In the comments of Hack Music Theory's video, I tried to clarify the distinction I make between polymeter and polyrhythm, but decided there would be value in refining my points and addressing this in video format with a little more research. Polymeter and polyrhythm are similar in that they are both centered around the idea of juxtaposition, but the difference is that these juxtapositions occur over different timescales. In his master's thesis, Metric Interplay, a case study in polymeter, polyrhythm and polytempo, Martin Galvao makes a clear distinction between measure-preserving polyrhythms, referred to simply as polyrhythm, and beat-preserving polyrhythms, or polymeter. Looking at it this way, a polyrhythm would be characterized by each individual rhythmic stream completing their cycles over a shared duration, thereby preserving regular meter length. Conversely, a polymeter would be characterized by the preservation of beat length, consequently delaying the synchronization of each rhythmic stream. In other words, using these definitions, polyrhythms will always share the same beat 1, whereas polymeter will only periodically share the same beat 1. The distinction between polymeter and polyrhythm is important because they are perceived as two distinct musical experiences. In an article entitled "Can Musicians Track Two Different Beats Simultaneously?", Yves Poudrier and Bruno Rep note that, although all polyrhythms are potentially polymetric, we contend that simple polyrhythms are rarely so perceived because simple pulse trains are generally insufficient to give rise to independent metric hierarchies. Rather, the common way to perceive such polyrhythms is as a sequentially integrated rhythmic pattern, a composite rhythm, within a single, perhaps ambiguous, metric framework, or else as two unrelated pulse streams, neither, or perhaps only one of which, is associated with a metric hierarchy. In other words, in a simple polyrhythm there is often the implication that one pulse stream is dominant, especially in a situation where a polyrhythm is introduced after a meter has already been established. For example, if a straight 4/4 rock beat is established, but after 4 bars a triplet idea is introduced, it is more likely that the triplet will be perceived as a subdivision of the original beat, rather than as a separate, independent idea. I think Hack Music Theory's example of a polymeter was an interesting and effective demonstration of a rhythmic displacement idea, but I wasn't entirely satisfied that it was a polymeter. This is because their example displaced an accent every 5 notes, but this happened over a 4-bar loop, so each cycle the first accent was reset to the master beat 1. Because this idea happens on such a small scale, there is a clear dominant pulse, the underlying 4/4, so the accent displacements, to me, feel more like unusual syncopations rather than two independent simultaneous metric frameworks. Let's illustrate the difference between polymeter, polyrhythm, and syncopation. An example of a simple polymeter would be 3 bars of 4/4 juxtaposed with 4 bars of 3/4. An example of a simple polyrhythm would be a 2/3 rhythm. An example of a syncopation would be dotted quarters in a 4/4 beat. So now let's look at some examples of polymeter found out in the wild. The first example is from The Little House I Used to Live In by Frank Zappa. It juxtaposes bass, drum and organ parts in 11/8 with the sax melody in 12/8. It doesn't let the cycle naturally resynchronize as it cuts short the final bar of 11/8, but it is persistent enough to be recognized as a polymetric idea. This second example is from My Human Gets Me Blues by Captain Beefheart and the Magic Band. This is slightly more complex. The The guitars are in 7/4, the drums are in 4/4, and the bass alternates between a triple meter and duple meter, adding an extra layer of complexity. The cycle between the guitars and drum set is allowed to naturally complete once, but the guitar phrases are extended with an additional beat on the repeat in order to synchronize the parts for the next section. Finally, let's look at a grey area which I think ultimately just counts as accent displacement rather than polymeter, but which uses phrases that hint at other metric structures. This is from one of my own pieces called Life Through a Letterbox, and I think that the accent displacement idea is similar to that in Hack Music Theory's example of Polymeter. As far as YouTube goes, Signal's Music Studio communicates the difference between polymeter and polytempo very clearly and very succinctly, and I highly recommend it if you're new to the topic. I've also attached the literature I referenced in the description, although I probably wouldn't recommend these as entry-level texts. I don't think they were entirely wrong, but I did find their example to be a little unclear. I think this is a result of their format. Their examples seem designed to be as accessible as possible, and this manifests in a reliance on piano roll notation, as opposed to standard notation, and on short, digestible examples. I think it is the small scale of the example format which resulted in it being, in my view, potentially misleading. In other words, I think what is usually a strength of this channel, in this particular instance, was a weakness of this video. Not a huge issue, but one I felt compelled to address nonetheless. Last time I mentioned that I'm working on a video which addresses musical form and cognition. This is in very early stages of development, and it's quite a complex issue, so I'll be bringing out another Zappa analysis before then, as they seem to be high in demand and I enjoy doing them. Hope this video was a useful insight into some of the work I explored, and I hope I did a good job clarifying the difference between polymeter and polyrhythm. Feel free to leave feedback. I recognise there will be different opinions on my assertions here, especially given my criticism of Hack Music Theory's example. I was pleased with the standard of discussion in the comments section in my last video, but among some of the positive reinforcement and the Wildian wit were some perfectly fair comments about the quality of my audio source and the general audio balance. I am aware of these problems and I am gradually fixing them, but some of the issues require new gear, and how quickly these improvements to my videos as surface aesthetic will be implemented depends on when I am able to comfortably invest in this equipment, so thanks for being patient. And finally, you may have noticed from my previous videos that I do all my own transcriptions and I am a composer myself. I do rent out my transcription and composition services, so contact me using the email in the description if you need a hand to hire for any projects. And if you prefer to just listen to music, I do make some of my material available on Bandcamp, so I wholeheartedly recommend that you go listen to it, lest you regret it for the rest of your sad, miserable little life.